What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and we actually recently got a chance to play my Tuesday night game, where if you don't know, I'm actually in the process of playtesting the new One D&D rules. I am using a One D&D species, the human. I am using a One D&D class, the rogue, and a One D&D subclass, the thief, which is the one that's included. I'm also only using things like One D&D feats and things of that nature. And we're trying it at the table with a hybrid approach. One of the players is pure 5e, another one is 1D&D class, but a 5e race and subclass. So we're trying all of these different things out. The one thing that we are doing is using basically the rules that are described in the rules glossary of 1D&D, right? So we've got the heroic inspiration and stuff of that nature. So this session, I was going to do the whole thing where we record after the fact with the whole party, but honestly, we're just so excited to play, we didn't even think about it, and everybody just kind of left. So you're just going to get me for the playtest vlog number 3. Here's the thing, though. It was primarily a role play session, a lot of world building, story building, kind of getting us where we were going. There were some roles, sure, but nothing that really led into no combats, no in-depth mechanics of any kind. The one thing that really kind of came up in this that was tied to this was the use of the newest version of guidance. So the ranger in our party is the 1D&D base ranger, so he does get cantrips, and as such, he has guidance as one of those cantrips. Now, I will say I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I do like the newest version of guidance. I think it does, to a degree, which we'll talk about in a second, help to push off and stave off, negate the constant need to spam guidance all the time. Which, even though I'll admit, this often as it gets spammed in the games that I run and things of that nature, it maybe shouldn't, just because of the way the spell actually works mechanically. Like, you have to cast it and then make it, while you're concentrating on it, and then make it. Whereas it seems like a lot of people are like, ooh, guidance. They give it to you kind of as you're making the roll, which shouldn't really work. Which I like the concept of fixing that by making it a reaction to when you fail a roll, which is good. But the particular instance that we found ourselves in, now I will tell you, first of all, there is a way to fix it, but it was a weird situation, and the mechanics kind of gave things away in that respect. So we made a handful of different checks this evening. Now, perception checks, well, there's two examples, right? Perception checks and insight checks are one where it gets weird. Now, you also say, and I can agree that, right, we all do our best to not metagame, right? But sometimes it kind of just happens, and it's hard. And then, you get into that weird situation where, am I purposefully choosing the wrong thing to not metagame? So let me give you two examples that came up tonight. We're all walking through the woods or something like that, and the DM says, make a perception check. Okay. Now, you could argue that the fact that the DM, and this is a metagaming kind of a thing for sure, but the DM's asking for a check, there must be something to see. So everybody makes a perception check, and it's a variety, it's like 8, 16, and a dirty 20, right? Something like that. So, okay. Now, the way the new guidance works is if you're within 10 feet of somebody and they fail an ability check, you can roll a d4 and add it to that ability check. So first of all, it gets into the weird thing of if the DM is allowing varied degrees of success, right? So let's say the 16 gets you some information and the 20 gets you more information. When does it be considered a failure, right? So if the threshold is a 10 for any information and you roll below it, is that's clearly a failure, right? If you said the base DC for a little snippet of information is 10, you roll below it, you failed, you could roll the D4 and possibly try to up it to at least hit that number. But what if the maximum amount of information could be obtained at a 25 and I rolled a 21, let's say? Now, I got all the information that possibly could have been given out from everything from 10 to 20, but if the final last pinnacle piece of really good information that could be offered from this skill check comes at a DC 25, and I rolled a 21, do I benefit from guidance in this instance, right? Because technically I didn't fail the check. I succeeded and I got information. I didn't get all the information, but I got information. In that instance, I would rule that no, me as the player rolling a 21 does not get to get the benefit of guidance to hit the 25. Now, again, that is a purely mechanical thing that the DM controls. I'm just trying to talk it through from a mechanics perspective. So because the DM would tell me, hey, you got this information, and, Ted, you got this information, I'm in the assumption at that point that that's all the information that I should have gotten. But I wanted to address this because there was more, so I technically failed to attain that information, but I still succeeded on the check. So I'd say in that instance, no guidance. It also potentially, it can get interesting with like the concept of a DM just asking you to roll a perception check to keep you on your toes and there's nothing to actually see. So, right, it's like, okay, I want to, and the other instance is, like I said, it comes when players initiate their own ability checks. And I think I'm definitely always been and more so leaning into the words of like, you don't get to just say, hey, I want to make this, because it doesn't really work in that instance, right? So, hey, I don't know, we've been walking for a while. I want to make a perception check to see if there's anything around. Okay. So you make a perception check and you roll an 8. Then you look to the DM, and the DM's would probably normal response would be, well, no, there's nothing to see. But then you say, DM, did I fail that perception check? Because if I did, and I'm in 10 feet of my ally who can cast guidance, he gets to roll a d4 and add it to it. And now you're in that weird spot as the DM. Well, okay. Now the party very clearly knows that something is here, right, in theory, because they know they failed the perception check. And they're going to try to add that d4. So say they do and they roll a 4, and it puts that overall perception check at a 12, but the DC was 15. So the DM says, okay, basically, you still failed initially, so there was something to be graded or measured against. You failed, you used the guidance, and maybe you still failed, but now you're automatically thinking, okay, something has to be here because you're inadvertently metagaming that the DM wouldn't have told me I had failed to use the guidance, but also the DM didn't tell me to make a perception check. I said I want to make one. So in that instance, I guess you kind of lean into the concept of the DM decides when you can make a roll. You can't just say, hey, I want to make a perception check to look for this. And again, that's a little bit of thing because you might be like, hey, can I make a perception check to make sure nobody's following us? And the DM says, sure, and you roll a 12. Now, if you didn't have this version of guidance, the DM might say, no, nobody's following you, or you don't think anybody's following you, but you're like, 12, is that a failure? And the DM says, well, yes, okay, so then you need to roll that guidance, but now you're like, okay, somebody obviously is following us because I know I failed before, and maybe I only rolled a 1, so I still think nobody's following us, but in my heart of hearts as a player, I now know that through that knowledge, someone is indeed following us. An easy way to kind of, again, combat this, like I said, don't let players self-initiate checks like that. There are instances where that makes sense, but you basically need to be, as the DM, having folks make rolls when there is nothing to happen. Like, you say, hey, you failed the roll, you make that check, add the guidance, but ultimately there was nothing to actually see there. But you're using this as sort of like a false red herring to keep them off the trail so they're not metagaming about it. The other instance that's probably a little bit more real that we see a lot more often is the insight check, all right? So in the game tonight, we were randomly found in the woods by like a 4-year-old child. And I, as a D&D player of many years, am immediately on edge at the presence of this child. So I say to the DM, can I make an insight check to see if this kid's, like try to check his vibe, see if he's telling the truth, stuff like that. Or like, sometimes people will give you qualifiers that there's no reason you could make an insight check for. Like, hey, I want to make an insight check to see if I think this kid is actually a kid and not like something in disguise. Now, I will remind you that in this campaign that I'm playing in is based on Greek mythology, so the concept of a god appearing as a child is not an uncommon thing that could happen. So if I say to the DM, hey DM, can I make an insight check to see if I think this is actually a child and not something else in disguise? And the DM says, go ahead and make an insight check, and I make one, and I roll a 8, and the DM is just like, and then I have to look at the DM and I say, well, was that a failure? and then she will say yes or no, and then I can add the guidance and go from there. But the fact that if it was a failure means that there was a means of which I could succeed, therefore there's a number to overcome for this. Whereas I guess if it was just a kid, I would not have to, I would be a failure because I would say, oh, it's just a kid. But do you see where I'm going with this? Whereas like insight to tell if somebody's lying, and you're like, hey, I want to make an insight check to tell if they're lying. 13, is that a failure? And the DM says, yes. Go ahead and roll guidance. You're like, well, regardless of what I roll in this guidance, if I get the number, they're clearly lying. The DM told me the check failed. And that's kind of where we got into a wonky situation where and it was mostly almost entirely based around insight checks to try to determine whether people were telling the truth or not. And the DM got to the point where she was like, it's kind of annoying when you do this because it gives things away, because I need to tell you if you fail so that you can use your reaction to cast guidance. Now, you could also argue in the situation that possibly casting guidance in such a way will alert kind of what's going on, that something more is happening. But we're, in this particular instance, again, we were trying to take a lost 4-year-old child back to their home. In theory, if that is actually a child, like, what are they going to do? But, if you just, like, spout off a quick spell, but because the new version of guidance happens as a reaction, like, it happens so fast in relation to a failure. So we ended up getting to the point where the player would be, like, rolling a d20 and a d4, and then telling the DM it's either a 10 or a 13. So that, like, if they succeeded, the DM knew ahead of time, rather than saying, hey, I rolled a 10, the DM saying that's a failure, you automatically knowing that there was a number to succeed on, and then rolling the d4 after the fact. Maybe I'm over-exaggerating this a little bit, but in that instance, it's basically no different than the original version of guidance, where you're just rolling it every time you make a d20 roll. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Any ideas on how to combat this? I'm very curious what your thoughts are, and hopefully we can work this out to make sure that whatever updates... It's a little bit different with something like the new version of Resistance, which is when you fail a saving throw, add a d4 to it, and that works very well because, like, if it's a saving throw, you very clearly know something is happening that's forcing you to do that. Same thing, like, if like we think True Strike will be the same thing but with an attack roll, you're very clearly making an attack roll. You know what you're doing, so possibly turning it into a success isn't as big a deal. But the fact that these are ability checks and there's kind of weird things that happen there, I'm just curious what you have to say about it. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.